So what I'm basically trying to do with this series is to learn how to build a GraphQL system, to learn how GraphQL actually works. It means that at the end of this series, we must be able to build a functional GraphQL system that is able to accept a GraphQL request. The request might be a query, the request can be a mutation, and is also able to process that request. It's also able to give a response back to the clients. That's what we're trying to do at the end of the day, right? But before we go into that, I quickly want to show us, while I also learn, how query actually works and how mutation actually works. We're going to be doing this using an Apollo sandbox. We're not dabbling into coding yet. We're just going to understand how these two concepts actually works. And when we get full understanding about that, we'll dive right into writing the code, building the GraphQL system. Let's get into it. We spoke about queries and we spoke about mutation. All right. And we said that queries are basically synonymous to your API request. All right. It is only the fact that queries is only able to read data. All right. Things like your get all, things like that. But when you start to talk about mutations, mutations are basically queries. But the difference between your mutation and GraphQL query is that your mutation is able to alter the state of your data. That's the difference. All right. So we're going to be looking at queries first. Just like you'd have it in your REST APIs, before you actually do any sort of queries at all, you need to be able to know the resources that are available to you to be able to query. And if you check this out, you would see all of this resource, right? So we have the album resource, we have the comments resource, we have the photo resource, and we have the to-do resource. By the way, this particular client is connected to a dummy server. So this is my dummy server, right? This dummy server is basically just a dummy GraphQL server that you can plug into, and it gives you all of this. It gives you all of this dummy resource to be able to play around with, basically. All right. So yeah, so having known all of this resource, to start your query at all, you need to begin with this keyword called query. All right. So this is what tells GraphQL that you're actually wanting to send a query. And then you go this way. It's basically like you're writing JSON, right? Other than the fact that it is not JSON, because it doesn't have your double quotes that your JSON would usually have. So on specifying that you want to write a query, this is the keyword. You have to start with that. You then need to specify the resource that you're going to be working with, the resource that you actually want to query. All right, so this is going to be doing a lot of autocompletes, but I really want you to get how it works rather than just using the autocomplete. So you could actually specify any resource, right? You could specify any resource. So say, for example, I want to work with the to-do resource. So you actually need to also specify the fields, all right? Because if you were working with a REST API and you just do a get on to-dos, you're obviously going to get an array of to-do objects, all right? But with GraphQL, and that's the difference between GraphQL and REST API, you need to specify the fields that you actually need, all right? So I can say I want the ID field. Okay, so in to-dos, we also have data. We also have data, and you could check what to-dos is actually made of. You could open to-dos, all right? So now if we go into this to-do object, these are the things that we actually need, all right? So we could go into data and specify that in data we need the ID, all right? We want the title and we want the completed, all right? So this is what your query looks like, right? We specified the query keyword, and then we're going down into the objects, into the resource that we actually want to make a query on, and then we're specifying the fields that we need in the query, in the to-dos resource. All right, we're going into data because data contains all of the other fields that are actually reasonable to us, and within data we're specifying that we want the ID, we want the title, and we want completed. So I can easily just run this and we have all of those data. You can see You can see that beautiful stuff right there. The next thing I'm also going to talk about now is the concept of nested queries. There are times whereby, and that's why it is called GraphQL. It's called GraphQL because you could actually go from one resource to another resource and to another resource, and they are all just interconnected with each other, right? So I'm saying within this particular to do, you could actually specify that you want the user object. Now, this is a user resource. User is a totally different resource. But I could go into this user resource and also extract or query some particular detail within this particular user. Obviously, this particular user is related to this to do in the sense that this user created or wrote this particular to do object. And that's why we have that sort of relationship, right? That sort of graph interconnectivity between both resources. So I could also specify that I want the name of this user. I could specify that I want the phone number of this user. All right, so this is what is called nested queries. You're basically making nested queries, and it can go as deep as the schema specifies. It can go as deep as the schema specifies. So if I run this now, all right, so now you can see that I have, aside from the fact that I have the to-dos, I also have the user that actually created the to-do, right? I have the username, I have the phone number of that particular user. So this is what is called nested query. So it is not always useful when you are unable to actually specify that you want this particular data. All right, you would not always want the list of data, hence the concept of arguments in queries. So let's see how to pass arguments in queries. An argument in GraphQL is somewhat different from arguments in REST APIs, but I don't want to go ahead of myself. Let's just take it one step at a time. And before we actually talk about arguments, you could also name your queries. All right, so I could title this get to do's. So you could also name your queries as well, and it gives you the same results, nothing changes. All right, you could name your queries. Now, to be able to pass arguments into your queries, you can either pass your arguments directly. So I could come in here and say I want a single to do. Obviously, you are not going to pass your arguments wanting a multiple to do. That doesn't work. So you obviously want a particular unique type of to do, hence the reason why you are passing an argument. So I could say I want a to do where the ID is 2. And the reason why it is throwing an error here is because if you check the to do resource itself. So let's go back to check the to-do definition. If you check the to-do definition, it does not contain anything like data. All right, so that's the reason why it's throwing an error. So we need to remove this object. We need to remove this and specify what to-do actually has. So to-do has ID. Don't forget, you can be tempted if you've written REST API for a while, you can be tempted to put comma, but don't put comma, it doesn't work. You have title, and you can have completed, and we can also get the user. Don't forget the concept of nested queries. You can also get the user, and you can get the phone number of the user. All right, so this is get to do. So we can run this, and this is going to give us a single to do. Right, so you can see that it's giving us a to do where ID is actually 2. All right, so this is how to pass arguments in your queries, in your GraphQL queries. Now, you would usually not always add code your arguments. All right, this is not useful. This is not useful. We want to be able to dynamically pass our arguments into our queries, hence the concept of variables. So GraphQL queries also enables you to pass variables, and the way you write your variables is by starting by your $sign. So you can say this query accept a to-do ID, and this to-do ID is a type of ID. It's a type of ID. Don't forget, ID is also a type in GraphQL. If you do not know about that, I would advise that you just check the previous videos and you can get up to speed on that. Now, because I always want this to do ID to be filled, I'm going to pass this symbol It's called the not symbol, it's called emphasis symbol, whichever one you want. So I can easily pass my to-do ID here and say to-do ID. And now what this means is to be able to run this particular query, I need to be able to pass this as an input parameter. That's basically what it means, because now it is not a variable. This is required. And that's what this emphasis symbol means. It means that this ID is required. So if I run this, it's going to throw an error because we did not pass. And you see, variable to do ID is a required type. All right. So you can easily come here and say to do ID. This is where we basically fill up variables in the whole Apollo clients thing. So we can pass, and to do ID is an ID, you can pass an ID of 2. And when we run that now, we get the same result. All right, so let's consider this particular use case for queries lastly. So let's say, for example, I want to get 2 to-dos. All right, so I'm just going to reduce this a bit. So we can have some real estate here. I'll reduce this a bit. So let's say that the expectation is that I pass an alternate thing to do, also declare its ID, and it's also compulsory. Now let's say this particular to do as well needs to be passed. So you can say to do is also taken to do too. So this is autocomplete. I'm going to remove this because we've already defined what we want. All right, so to do, I want the exact same thing. Now let's say for this, I probably do not want the same thing. Let's say I do not need the user phone number. I just want the username, and I do not need the completed. I just want this. Now these are obviously 2 different object need, but you see that because they are having the same field, the same resource, there is a conflict. All right, so this is where aliases comes into place, where query aliases comes into play. So rather than having this conflict, if you run this, you're going to have an error. It's not going to work. So rather than having this conflict, we can basically have an alias to say, so we can say this is main to do, right? And we can say this is alt to do. Alt to do. All right, so this main to do is an alias for this particular query, and this alt to do is an alias that we've defined for this particular query. So if we run this now, alt to do is required. Oh, okay, so we are supposed to pass alt to do as a variable. We're supposed to supply that. So let's say alt to do is 5, and let's run that now. Now you see our results. We are able to get the main to do, and we are also able to get the alt to do. So that's the concept. That's the concept of aliases in queries. So with the understanding of all this, I think we are good to go on queries. Let's dive right into mutations. So just as we have said, your schema, your GraphQL schema is able to help you see what is possible, what is made available, and the different operations that your GraphQL server is able to process. All right, so if you check out this root type, obviously, which is just drawing from our query, from our schema rather, you are able to see mutations. And if you click on mutations, you can easily see all of the mutations that is possible. All right, so these are the mutations that our GraphQL server supports, is able to handle. All right, so we can easily just pick any one of them and make use of it. All right, so for our mutations, just as you have queries as a keyword for query, we also have mutation as a keyword for mutation. So we can use this to specify a particular mutation, and we can determine the type of mutation we want to process. All right, so there are different mutations on all of the resources. We can see here, you have create album, create comments, create photos, blah, blah, blah. We're going to be creating to do. All right, so with the understanding of variables and arguments, you can easily tell what this means. All right, you can easily tell that this mutation, this is autocomplete anyways, I didn't type it. You can easily tell that this mutation is expecting an argument, all right, and this argument is passed into a variable called input, and this argument is of a type called create to do input. Now, if you come to our variable pane, just to prove that this is actually a variable, you can see that we already have input, and this input is expecting this type. Now, if we do not know what this type is, all right, we can easily just go into our mutation and see what this type is. So we can easily see what this type is, all right, and we can fill it in from here. All right, so that's basically how it works. So we can easily say create to do, and our create to do is expecting an input. Obviously, your mutation would always be expecting an input. That's why you have this input, and this is expecting. We can easily create those objects in here, all right, but because we are using a variable and our variable is being passed as an argument, we can also supply this variable in here. So we can easily say, all right, so we can easily supply our inputs. So if you check our create to do, now you can see what this create to do input is actually expecting. It is expecting title and it's expecting completed. So we can easily pass all of those. We can come in here and pass our title, and our title is new to do. And we can also pass completed, and because our completed is a boolean value, we can easily just say false. Now this is our input parameter, end of file expected. What does that mean? Oh, okay. All of this needs to be wrapped in this. Now we can also specify the fields that we want to see as the result of this particular mutation. So we are just basically saying that once this particular to-do has been created, what should be returned to us, all right? So, and these are the fields that we're saying here. So you can easily say, okay, once this is created, I want to see what the ID is, I want to see the title, and I want to see the completed, all right? So if we run this, now we can see our ID. Our ID is 201. Our title is this, and our completed is this. So that's how your query works, and that's how your mutation works. In the next video, we're actually going to be building a full-fledged GraphQL server that is able to, again, accept GraphQL queries, and is also able to accept GraphQL mutation. Is able to interface with the database. We're going to be using .NET and Hot Chocolate. Is able to interface with the database using entity framework core, and it's able to supply a response back to the client. That sounds fun. If you've not subscribed to this channel, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you hit the like button, and make sure you leave a comment in the comment section below if you want to say something nice. I'll catch you guys on the next one. Cheers, guys.